Well, hello. I'm Sonatina. It's February 18, 2022, and this is Linguistics You Can Use. Welcome to another week of talking about how linguistics works in our world. What are we all about in terms of how language works um, in our society and how that relates to how we relate to each other. Oh, that's like the word of the day, kinda. Um, so let's go ahead and fade into the freedom of nothing. Um, so I was actually going to I was going to create a little title for you to enjoy the name of the episode, but I forgot this week because I was fiddling with other settings. But hey, you understand, right? Like video production is kind of hard. The theme of the week, if you have been reading the description box, is relationships. Well, relationship. It's a bit of a wonky, splitting of hairs. Wonky, splitting. Um, but that's what this is all about, right? The exploration of what is it that we mean by words and how does that affect our relationship with someone else. And if you have a relationship with more than one person, you've more than one relationship. You have relationships. So, yeah, like they're basically the same word. Um, okay. If you have any thoughts on relationships, like what they mean to you in your life, the word itself, how you think about um the concept, like what do we do? What do we mean by being in relationship with someone else? Right? So, in the description, in the kind of show introduction teaser, I wrote that a word that brings up a complex web of ideas. What does it mean to be in relationship with someone or something? Right? Because our society focuses a lot on particular kinds of relationships and values those above all others. And that's just not how people really work, right? People have individual uh, levels of need for different kinds of relationships. So, for some people, a romantic relationship is going to be non important to not unnecessary, even in somebody's life. And, in the same way, people have, you know, to have some people are very gregarious in their relationships in that you know, they like being around people. And so they just have people always around. They just collect people in a good way. Some would say I can be a collector of people. Um, Goodbye to Aquarius season. The Some would say the sign of a relationship. So we are looking at relationships with the world and with ourselves. So as I teased, there are lots of things we mean when we refer to the word relationship. So, like any good linguist, let's go to the dictionary and read what it says about relationships. So, I'm actually um I looked this up yesterday because, I prepare now. I think that this is a worthy enough project for me that I am now actually preparing before I go on air, so it's not as rambly. So yeah, let me know, like I said, what you think of the format. So we're looking up relationship. So relationship, it's a noun, right? And the way that this dictionary defines it is the state, the state. Oh, I wrote it up here because it's actually kind of difficult to read it down here. But anyway, so the state of being related. That's the first definition of relationship. The state of being related. And already, right, we have a lot of different ideas coming into ourself when we listen to that. What does related mean? How is that? Yeah. So the second one, the second definition they have, the mutual exchange between two people or groups who have dealings with one another. So I like this one, right? Because it brings us to the action of the noun. Well, that makes it kind of a verb, but we're not getting to grammar today. We're not going to do that. We're getting into the theory of relationships. So, the mutual exchange. I like that they put that mutuality in there. First thing, mutual exchange between two people or groups who have dealings with one another, right? So this definition has a lot of concepts in it, even more than the first one, obviously, because it's more words. So this definition implies that two people, two individuals can be in a relationship with each other, and those two people can themselves form a unit and be in relationship with one or more other people. And then we get societies. And then we have to figure out how to work together when the people that we like to be in relationship with come up against the people we don't like to be in relationship with. Because here's the thing, we all have to live in the same planet. It's kind of like, if you had siblings, you had to live in the same house with people that you maybe had to just, deal with, get along, like not even get along with, just deal with. Just, you know what? It's not forever, right? You don't have to be around somebody forever. Anyway, what I'm saying is I like this definition. And finally, as we just, got to, right? Because we get too quickly to family when it comes to this word, kinship is the third definition that this fabulous book gives us. So, the state of being related, that made me want to look up relate. Like, what does that mean? Does it have more nuance, more interesting things to dig into? And this is, luckily, on the same page, right above it, what this dictionary says about this word, the definition. It is a present participle. Again, we're not getting into grammar. I just wanted to throw that in because they reference it. To tell the story of, recount, narrate. Well, that is just not even anywhere near what we were just discussing, right? Like, now we're into storytelling. What is that about? Where did we get from being, being with association with somebody else to telling stories? Well, this is the second definition of relate, which I think is, great. To show or establish a relation between. So now we get into, right, how these words are related. Oh, like they have a relationship with each other. Language is fun. So the third definition of relate, to have or be in relation. Okay, so, relationship, relate. The final word that keeps popping up, it seems, is relation, right? You have relations. So I just wanted to highlight the one definition of relation because there's a bunch of them. Because that word, this relation, that is a doozy. That has a lot of stuff on it. So I'm going to focus in on this one, which is associated with what we're talking about today in terms of relationship, which is definition of relation. The way in which one thing is associated with another. Now that's not the first one in this dictionary. Wonder I should get bring in a modern dictionary and reference a couple of them now that I'm doing this on a regular basis. So anyway, to tell the story of, oh no, that's relate. The way in which one thing is associated with another. And that got my, gears a turning and thinking all about how the way that we tell stories about people in our lives determines how we develop our relationships. And this, I feel, comes to the essence of this word and this concept and why it mixes so well with you know storytelling and being family are kind of one idea in this. So let's see. I wrote notes on this, so oh, that's right. Okay. So right now in our world, we're going through kind of coming out of a pandemic. And before this time, for a long time, the majority of people didn't have a lot of opportunity, a lot of time to really examine our relationships, right? Like, we didn't necessarily have the ability to find people that be in we could relate to, we could relate with outside of our immediate vicinity. So we didn't maybe have the opportunities to really examine how we actually want to relate to people. When we were exposed to how different people, relate to each other, when we expose each other's when we expose our family dynamics, our cultural dynamics, when we talk about ourselves, right? This so focus on each individual story, it's made us aware that there are just such an infinite ways of relating to each other and being in relation with each other and having relationships. And not all of these methods, not all of these ways are going to be good for everybody. That's the point, right? We wouldn't have all of these different ways of being in relation with each other if one way worked for everyone, right? Every single person has to figure out for themselves with each other person, group, activity they do, what their relationship is going to be with that. And, you know, as I was saying, we as a culture didn't have a great time doing that recently. Um, being able to examine how we relate to each other. And growth can be challenging, right? So we are raised with a certain way, and most people, right, are comfortable, like to stay within comfortable boundaries that they understand. So when we are exposed to these other ways of being and relating with each other, we begin to wonder, do we want to maintain the ways that we relate to each other, or do we want to change? And that, you know, is a very fraught question for most people, including people who do want to change. Because, as I said, we are creatures of comfort. We like to be in a comfortable, situation, or we like to understand what might come next, right? We like to be kind of assured of our future. Now, there's a part of us probably that understands that we can never be assured of our future. But the vast majority of people want to create a stable existence as much as possible. And so, growth, people changing and deciding that the way that they relate to people is, it can be a little bit of a doozy to others in your life. Um, you know, some people that we interact with don't want us to change, right? I'm sure you have people, right, in your life that are not interested in exploring new ideas with you because they're comfortable. They might be happy, right? And even if they're not, they're comfortable, right? It's not, people have different motivations. And to me, it's as important to respect somebody else's path and journey and timeline as it is to, you know, develop my own and push myself on my timeline. So it makes sense that there are people in your life that would resist change, you changing, and different ways of seeing how we can be in relation with each other, because that means that all of a sudden their comfortable familiarity is now gone, right? Their So much of their world is about, the what is it, around them, the stability around them, that one person, right, can pull out the whole Jenga tower, as it were. So a lot of people try to prevent others from changing and themselves from changing. And it's just not possible, right? We know that life is about change. None of us are the same person we are even a year ago, 5, let alone 10 to 15 years ago, right? And we can have people in our lives for our entire lives, and relationships can change, and it's good to have different phases of times when you have, you know, engagement with others in different ways, right? So there's I feel like there's a great sense of fear of loss, right? in our culture, and because it's almost impossible for me not to, getting into the, how we structure our world subject, the way that our current economic system, you know, capitalist being the people who can hoard the most capital, the most resources, have the most power, it means that there's a lack of incentive to cooperate with others. And I just don't think that that's a great way to organize our society. So it makes sense to me to want to change that. And I can understand if, you think that you should be the person that is in charge because you are the smartest person based on the ability to hoard the most resources, right? That's a perspective. That's to me that's that capitalist perspective. You know, that's fine, I guess, but like I don't have to agree with you and I don't have to like engage with you. I can just like try and convince people that my ideas are the better way to do things, which I think they are because it's only been very recently that we've been in this much of a like, you know, I must kill you to survive kind of way. If we look at archaeological evidence, right, humans are much better when we cooperate. When we are able to create systems of trading and exchange without hurting each other, like with physical violence, it makes it a lot easier to like do trading and stuff, right? Like the most prosperous uh times in the history of a group of people have been when they have finished their warring and the trade routes are established and like trade can flow very freely and easily. So it's like basically the people who are trying to fight are trying to be the ones who control, right, that those passages so they get the protection money for help making sure that the nefarious people don't attack and kill others. You know, humans have created a funny society. I mean, I don't think I've ever explained it that way before, even to myself, but that's an interesting way of like looking at how we have related to each other in the past. Oh, you didn't think I could bring it back to relationship? I can bring it back to relationship. So, um, part of, you know, this whole effort I made mention of at the beginning of the thing in terms of an association between linguistics education and communication education. This emphasis that I bring to the way I see the world is a very important part to me of this project because my frame of reference, the way that I was raised, the culture that I was raised in, and just a, little summation for those who might be tuning in for the first time. United States, child of the 80s and 90s, neoliberal, right, messaging everywhere all around me. Personal home, super hippiedom, kind of free love esque, um, but and yet all kind of protective and like, yeah, like adults have their world, keep the kids, in their fun world, and then they become adults and then they can do what they want because they're adults and that's how the world works. So, like, you know, my perspective is shaped a lot by the world at large that I was raised in and my immediate individual environment. Much like my personality was influenced by, my genetic code, and by the environment that I was raised in, because there are likely ways that I could have turned out if my environment had been a different way based on my personality. Because you have traits, but those traits develop in a particular environment, and that's just reality. So it's like if we want things to develop, if we want people to develop in maybe a more positive manner, have hope for the future, maybe we should raise people in a manner that encourages a positive sense of their self, you know? That's that is part of, like I said, the effort in terms of, or why I reference my culture and these linguistics education all the time. I speak a particular language. I have a particular worldview based on where I come from, as does everybody. And there seems, there was a big push in the 1900s that there was an ability to be objective on the world, right? If you just looked at the facts, you as an individual could be objective if you didn't take into consideration these particular factors that a particular group of people decided were not objective or objective, right? Like that was one of the arguments that I had with one of my journalism professors in college was this idea that there is no such thing as objectivity, right? He was so tied to the idea that he could take himself out of the story because all he was doing was relating facts to the public. No matter that he could not answer to the fact that he chose which things that happened in reality to choose and to include and not include, right? So that inclusion or non inclusion is a part of how we tell stories, how we relate information, and how we relate to each other, right? Going back to the definitions, the relationships that we have are based on the stories we tell each other. So if you claim a group of people as your family, that becomes your family. Language changes reality. And in that way, right, reality affects how we use language. Because in certain cultures, that might not be the word that they would use, you would use. The idea that we create groups of people and call them particular terms is culturally defined. So the term marriage is a really great one to analyze. This term, in the culture that I was raised in, had an implication for a long time that when it came to people, marriage was one man, one woman. And the reason for that didn't seem to be important for most people. Just the fact that that was the reality that they knew and they were told that that was the true reality that should always be, because that's what they always knew, that that word kind of lost a lot of other meanings that made their argument very false. Marriage, right, is a word, much like relationship, that kind of just means people who are in a particular association with each other, or things that are in association with each other, right? Marriage in English, in the way that it was used throughout my, and continues to be used throughout my language experience, is two things coming together. Two things or two people coming together. So there was this effort when I was a kid that of trying to redefine this term to mean only one man and one woman because of a push from certain other members of our society, me included, to say, well, like, the legal term that we're using is fine. We just need to, like, let other groups of people use it, i.e., people with the same genitals who like each other and want to be in a long-term relationship with each other. They should also be allowed to have a marriage, be married. And, you know, people who were like, oh no, my culture is being attacked. They were like, I don't want you to redefine this word to what it is. I will redefine it to what I want it to be. But that's not what the cultural message was, right? That's the power of language, and that's the power um, that we currently have in our society right now, where we have one particular viewpoint very strongly controlling the language of our culture. And this influences our understanding of how we have relations with each other. You have a relationship with yourself. Um, and, you know, if I had grown up in a different culture, my obsession with trying to understand others, might not have developed because I might have been more like the majority. So that's what I was talking about earlier about how our environment influences the way that our personality develops, right? I still would have, I'm sure, have been a curious little kid, but my obsession might not have dove so deeply into analyzing human behavior and communication and all that. Because that's the thing that confused me the most of all when I was dealing with people was I feel like people aren't actually communicating and I'm confused and I would like to not be confused. So I'm going to try really hard to help be not confused. And it took me until like now to figure out, you know, partly it was because I was autistic. But partly it's also because the culture at large doesn't encourage any big differences to be, um, allowed to exist in our society. So while my brain is, on in terms of like the bell curve of neurology, right? It's on the autistic manifesting side more. Um, but it's not quite, there because it was the way that our culture chose to define that brain was not aligned with how it manifested in me. And then we get back to the power of how language influences our society and our world and ourselves. When we are in an environment where we constantly hear negative messages about how you are, how I am, how we are, right? When we constantly hear things that are, we're told that, if you just change this thing about you, you would finally be able to be included and be, accepted. It's always like, well, what is it? Why is that thing so important for me to change? Why is it so important for your comfort to override my comfort in this area? And like nobody's ever been able to tell me a good answer to that other than, well, that's just the way it is. I'm in charge, so deal with it. Like, okay, I don't have to agree. So, you know, that's what I'm going with right now. So relationship is a complicated word, right? It doesn't just mean how, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, 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 partners. It doesn't just mean family. It means the stories we tell ourselves about the people we choose to associate with. And like, you know, we have different ways of telling those stories too. Some people have more flexibility in how they perceive this idea, and some people are more rigid. And in that same way, the way that I would think, rigid, somebody else would say, "Oh, that's not at all rigid." So I often come back to in my life, if I don't feel like somebody wants to be in a relationship with me, then it's easy for me to sort of let that go. I don't need to be in relationship with everybody because it's exhausting. This comes up against another problem we have in our society where some of us have have problems relating to a lot of people, right? We have there are less people that we feel comfortable with or that feel comfortable around us in order to develop these relationships. So there is this sense that if anybody gives attention, then that must mean that I should develop this relationship because I might not find somebody else who is willing to give me attention or reciprocate in any way for a long time, if ever again. And that's hard for people to deal with, especially when we think about what a social culture we are. And we don't have a lot of opportunities in the society that I currently live in to cultivate relationships outside of, romantic ways or spending a lot of money, right? Our culture is based around having resources. If you don't have the money to attend a social event, then it's hard to make friends that you might, you know, be able to have relationships with. Or it's hard to meet people that you might be able to have relationships with, become friends, become partners. And, there's lots of free ways to engage with the world. And there's also a lot of ways that those paths are not available, even still, to people with different accessibility needs, right? Coming back to the idea of, an autistic person, me going out into the world and having this underlying sense that I don't fit in. I'm probably not going to fit in. I'm going to try my hardest to figure out this community, but I mean, I haven't had good experiences with being welcomed before, so I'm gonna have to like really build up the energy to engage in this effort to make a community again. And then it doesn't work. And then you have, months to maybe years of recovery from the experience of being included, but also, not being included and not being able to understand what the social dynamics are going on. So, the idea that we, uh, it's easy for people, right, to meet others because of our interconnected world, not true. The idea that we, you know, that people shouldn't settle because, they're not, I don't know what that means, because it is the idea of like every relationship, everything, every time you engage with somebody else, there's potential for the relationship to develop in a good way. And sometimes it's clearer more quickly that it's probably not going to develop in a positive way. But sometimes it's not. And sometimes it's hard to know the difference when you don't have a lot of experiences or reference points to pull from in terms of what should a good relationship be. So, yeah, you have a relationship with yourself. It's not something that this culture that I am living in uh, really encourages you to get to know. That superficial understanding of independence that comes from the idea that, everyone wants to be like the people in charge, that is, it's fading. It's still present. And so be nice to yourself. Try to let yourself develop a good relationship with you and try not to worry about what other people think about how you relate to yourself. Because that's really, well, we have at the end of the day. And on that note, I would like to thank you for joining me on this exploration of relationship. If there is a word or an area of language you want to explore, let me know. I invite you to send me a message, email in the description, or send me a tweet at Sound Meaning on the Twitter, or chat. Put a chat. Let me know what you thought of this idea. I'd love to, you know, get your feedback and maybe have a little engagement with your idea of a relationship and how our ideas of relationship is changing in our world. Um, yeah, thanks. And that's all the linguistics you can use for this week. I hope this discussion of relationship was relevant to your life and helps you get out there having fun, crafting sound meaning. See you next week.